This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence. Something that I love about having a Squarespace website is being able to have a professional, organized landing page for all of my content. My About page allows me to have a quick overview of who I am as an artist and content creator. Then the Frequently Asked Questions page is a great resource for people who are new to my audience. And lastly, of course, having a gallery to showcase my strongest work all in one place. Plus, as my content and business evolves, I can easily customize the website to suit my needs at any time. So if you're interested in launching your own website, head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/imawonder for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Hello jelly beans, I am back with another jelly gouache video, and this time I will be using both sets that I own. One is technically from Himi and the other is from ArtX, but if I'm being honest, I'm pretty sure they're exactly the same, just with different color palettes and different brands on the front. Mine have mostly dried out at this point, but it's no biggie since you can just add water to them to reactivate the paints. Throughout the process, I just keep this little bottle of water handy so that I can keep re-wetting the pots of gouache. So if you're new to my channel, hello, welcome. I hope you enjoy your stay. Something that I like to do here every once in a while is to recreate a screen cap from some of my favorite TV shows and movies, and I provide a little bit of insight into my process as well as have a casual chat about my love for the movie or TV show. You can actually see on the other side of this sketchbook spread that I had done some background studies earlier this year from the film Klaus. I do have a video showing that process if you haven't seen it already. I use the jelly gouache for those studies as well. As you might have guessed, today's screen cap recreation is from one of my favorite Disney films, Mulan. I used an erasable colored pencil to do the sketches, and then I proceeded to block in the colors using really diluted washes of gouache, using it almost like a watercolor basically. My biggest tip with how I approach painting with gouache is that you want your initial layers to be quite thin, aka mixed with a lot of water, and then gradually use less and less water, which will result in a more opaque paint as you continue the layers. And the main reason why you want to work from thin to thick paint layers is because if the paint on the page ends up too thick, it can crack, and generally that's not the effect we want to achieve. Plus, I find that if you go in with really thick layers first and then you try to use really watered down thin layers on top, if it's too wet, the layer underneath will start like moving around, which again is probably not what you want to happen, but obviously it can be something that you can do if you want to alter the layer underneath. And that's the thing about the jelly gouache, if you don't already know, is that it is a water soluble paint. So even when it is dry on the paper or when it's dried on the palette, you can reactivate it with water, which can be a good and a bad thing. So you have to be very careful when you're painting layers on top of each other, because if you're scrubbing a little bit too harshly or the paint is super wet, then it can shift and move around. Because I know that jelly gouache seems to be something that people think is this like special magical paint for some reason, but it really is more or less the same as a regular gouache. If you prefer paint that's going to stay put after it's dry, then you're going to want to look into acrylic gouache, which is permanent after it's dry. Generally, my preferred painting process is that I like to move around from element to element, as opposed to starting and finishing the foreground or the middle ground and then moving on to the next. One of the reasons why I prefer to bounce around the painting is to allow the paint to dry in between layers, and another reason being that I think that it really helps give me an understanding of how the colors and values are looking in reference to each other. Everything looks so much darker and bolder when it's against the stark white paper, but as you probably see in the footage here, as soon as I add in that dark blue and green background, all of the other middle ground and foreground elements look significantly lighter. This is another reason why I prefer to work in thin layers so that I have lots of wiggle room to continue to adjust the colors and values. I'm not a very decisive person, so this allows me to slowly build up the painting and change it many times as I move through the process. For example, when I initially started the first few layers, I thought that everything looked too dark, but then as soon as I add in that dark blue and green background, I realized, oh, a lot of these elements can actually be a lot darker. I often get a lot of questions about mixing colors, and it really does come down to just a basic knowledge of color theory and experience. I know that people hate hearing the word practice as advice, but it is so commonly said because it's true. You learn and adapt through trial and error, and while yes, watching tutorials and reading about color theory is going to be helpful, the best way of truly improving and understanding is through putting in those hours and years of experience. Every artist works and thinks differently. Some people are very methodical and almost scientific in their approach, which I think makes them for great teachers because they have a clear and concise system in place to achieve the results that they want. I, however, and I'm sure many other artists as well, are a little bit more intuitive and don't necessarily have a concise, linear, or consistent process that can be easily explained. This is why I prefer to provide advice and just talk through some of my choices as opposed to an instructional tutorial, because sometimes I'm not even sure why I made some of the decisions that I make. For those of you who have been with my channel for a little while, you'll probably know that I have been generally dissatisfied with most of my work lately, and so one of my major goals this year was to continue developing my drawing and painting skills, but also to do more experimenting. The thing about art style is that it's always going to evolve as you gain more experience, but also when your taste level changes as well. When I was trying to evaluate why I was dissatisfied with my work, I looked to see what I found appealing about other artists' work and what I felt like was missing from my own. And so when I looked around at a lot of the art that really resonated with me, whether it be, old masters or artists that are contemporaries to me on Instagram and YouTube, I realized that one of the common traits was exaggerated stylization. This was actually the reason why I chose to do those Klaus background studies earlier this year, because I loved the use of shape and the stylized approach that it had in that film. And this is the reason why I like to do these screen cap recreations, is because I think that it's a really fun way to practice and learn about color palettes, composition, stylization, and more. But in order to avoid being just a hollow copy of another artist, it's important to learn and draw inspiration from multiple different sources. Our art style is really just an amalgamation of all of our different interests being filtered through us. So that is what brought me to doing a screen cap study of an animated Disney film, because the films, especially like the animated ones from the 90s, had a huge influence on me growing up, and I still adore them to this day. Something that I've been wanting to improve upon with my work is backgrounds and environments. This is an area that I'm often still intimidated by, and I also think that my eye for composition could definitely use some work as well. With those things in mind, I wanted to choose screen caps from the film that I felt had really strong compositions and interesting backgrounds, since that's something that I felt like I really needed and wanted to practice upon. And after working on these studies, the key thing that I noticed was that they both included a clear foreground, middle ground, and background. This creates a more dynamic piece and gives much more depth to the environment as well. What I loved about this first screen cap was this really high contrasting color palette of warm colored foreground and middle ground versus the very cool colored background. This contrast makes the piece feel really dramatic, and it really sets the tone for the scene of Mulan making the bold decision to impersonate a male soldier. This whole sequence in the film, when she cuts her hair and dons the uniform, it's so good. I love the drama of it, and the building music that's scoring for the scene as well. Oh, it's so good. And I also love that the dragon, aka the Mushu statue, along with the direction of the incense and the smoke, as well as the placement of the tombstones, they all help direct the eye and frame around the figure, aka Mulan. In that way, the viewer knows which is meant to be the emphasis of the scene. Then lastly, another thing that I took note of when working on this screen cap study was the use of a combination of gradients and cell shading. For whatever reason, I always seem to get into my head that when I approach rendering, I either have to have it super blended or that I can only commit to cell shading if I wanted a more graphic style illustration. But in doing this piece, I was reminded that you can definitely use both techniques within one illustration and have them work really well together. In the spirit of trying to let go of some of my perfectionism, the gradients in my rendition are definitely much more painterly and loose. You can see a lot of brush strokes, and it's definitely not a seamless, blend. But as you can see on the tiled floor, there is meant to be a gradation of colors to achieve the lighted, glowy effect. But then there's also some sharp cell shading on the Mushu statue as well, which might be a combination of wanting it to appear sharper since the object is closer to the viewer, as well as it being a hard, shiny material. In any case, I feel like I definitely learned a lot from doing that study, and I really like actually that color palette, the kind of warm orangey burgundy colors with the green, blue, teals. It's definitely something I'm going to keep in mind in the future. Then, moving on to the second screen cap study, we have this scene of Mulan and her father in their garden. Over on my Patreon page, I had actually had this screen cap and another one that I was debating between, which were both similar. They both were in the garden, but had very different color palettes, and the compositions were slightly different. But this one ended up being the winner, which is totally fair since this one does include Mulan with her father, whereas the other one was just the father all on his own. And this one also, like the previous screen cap, has the foreground element in it as well, which does make for a slightly more interesting composition. Not that interesting compositions necessarily need to have all three of these elements, but I do think that for the sake of what I'm trying to do with these screen cap studies, it did make sense to go with this one. But unlike the previous one, this scene has a much softer color palette and is very harmonious with each other, which creates a much more serene atmosphere. I often have people asking me about how I pick my color palettes for my illustrations, and I think that the best place to start is by picking limited colors. With this scene, you can see that the main colors here are pink, green, and blue. There is a strong sense of color harmony here by having the same shades of pink for the flowers included on Mulan's clothes, and then similarly the same shades of green of Mulan's father's clothing with the grass and the foliage around them. Using the same hues for various elements in the piece help keep the piece feeling really cohesive, and it also draws the eye around the composition as well. The big takeaway that I made note of after I finished this study was that you don't necessarily need to have line art on every individual item, nor does every single thing need to be super finessed. This was particularly the case with how I ended up approaching the flowers as well as the bridge in the background. Instead of painstakingly deciphering each individual petal on the flowers or the precise architecture of the bridge, I realized that having contrasting values was enough to give the impression of these things and have it still read clear enough for the viewer. Plus, I find that having the background elements be looser and more painterly also makes it feel like those elements are further away, which also gives a sense of depth as well. And like with the previous scene, the main focus is on the characters and the overall atmosphere, so the most important aspect was the figures to stand out, which of course is done by having them a darker shade in comparison to their surroundings. Basically, the main takeaway from doing these studies is that contrast is really, really important to create an effective and dynamic illustration or visual. As I mentioned earlier, Mulan is one of my favorite Disney films for a number of reasons. Of course, it would come to no surprise that I think stylistically it is gorgeous. I especially love that the chosen style feels very reminiscent of traditional Chinese paintings, with the way that the character designs have very soft, flowy shapes, and I particularly love the way that there's these like swirls drawn into the smoke in the fire. This is something that I find has been kind of lost with the newer 3D animated films, is that they no longer have that very distinct look from one another. When you compare the character designs from Mulan to Hercules, for example, they each have a very clear individual style that is referencing the era that the stories are set in. And I think that is one of the reasons why that the 90s animated Disney films appeal to me so much more than the newer ones do. Hercules is another one of my favorite Disney films, by the way, and I think that it is quite underrated. I remember growing up, one of my childhood friends had this Hercules cutlery set. It was, oh my gosh, I have such fond memories of eating grilled cheese off of those plates. If I could have those, oh man. A few weeks ago, actually, my partner asked me if I could go back in time for a day, which time period would I go to and what would I bring back? I felt super silly and uncool for this answer, but my initial answer was to go back to like 1998 so I could go to Disneyland or Disney World and acquire all the bomb-ass 90s Disney merchandise. If you couldn't tell, I never got to go to Disney World as a kid. I did get to take myself as an adult though, and while I had the absolute most fun, I will say that the thing that was missing was not having merchandise from the films that appealed to me the most, because obviously right now they're focusing all of the merchandise on the newer released films. So for me, I was like, I don't want Frozen merch. I want like Mulan and Hercules merch. Oh, and don't even get me started on the live action remakes. When I saw that they were selling the live action version of the tea set from Beauty and the Beast and not the original character designs from the animated film when I was at a Disney store. I felt like a tiny part of my soul had died. I know, that is so dramatic, especially since I had no intention of buying said tea set, regardless of which character designs had been used. But I just have this very protective and strong fondness for these movies from my childhood that when I saw that, I just like died inside. I actually have a very distinct memory of when I went to see Mulan specifically in theaters, and if you've watched my Q&A videos, you might remember this story, but basically the scene when Mulan is found out to be a woman and they abandon her in the mountains, I started sobbing and I asked my aunt to leave the theater because I was so upset. I was like 8 or something, by the way. And thankfully, my aunt kindly reassured me that she was going to be fine. And thankfully, you know, I got to see her triumph in the end. And yeah, to this day, I really just love and appreciate that the focus of Mulan's story is that she finds value and purpose on her own terms, and that a lot of the choices that she makes is from a place of wanting to protect her family. And don't get me wrong, I absolutely love romance stories, and for me, there is always room for strong, kick-ass female leads that find love. But I think what is especially crucial and what is so great about Mulan is showing that these characters have more to them than just finding romance. Also, I love that the internet has low-key declared Shang a bi icon, and we love to see it. And before I go, I just quickly wanted to show off the Patreon print and sticker rewards for this month, which has the theme of April showers. If you pledge for my Sapphire or Emerald tier anytime between now and April 30th, you'll receive this gal and this sticker in the mail. Plus, you'll also gain access to lots of exclusive content and exclusive videos that I post only on Patreon. Anyways, that concludes today's video. I hoped you maybe learned a thing or two, or that I at least kept you company while you also worked on something in the background. Let me know in the comments which are some of your favorite Disney films. I love chatting fandom stuff with y'all. So yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!